Picture something that has happened to half of every generation of not once, not rarely, every single month, for decades, in the life of billions of women across thousands of generations. It happened in every cave, every village, every empire that ever existed. And yet open almost any history book and you will find almost nothing about it. No detailed records, no named inventions, no proud craftsman credited with solving it, just silence, stretching back tens of thousands of years. That silence is strange, because the problem itself was never simple. Every month, without warning of the exact hour, blood needed to be managed while hunting, managed while walking for miles, managed while working in a field, managed without plastic, without cotton pads, without a single modern convenience. So what did women actually do for tens of thousands of years before any of that existed? The answer starts in the deepest part of the Stone Age, long before writing, before metal, before permanent settlements of any kind. Archaeologists believe women used moss, gathered fresh from riverbanks and forest floors. Moss holds liquid the way a sponge does, and it was everywhere, free, renewable. They packed it into wraps of soft leather or bundles of woven grass. Sometimes they added sand, layered underneath, to help pull moisture away from the skin. None of it was written down. There was no writing yet to write it down with. There was only the object itself, used, discarded, and forgotten by time. That is the first problem historians run into immediately. Moss decomposes. Leather rots. Grass disintegrates within a few short seasons. The very materials that solved the problem are the same materials that erased the evidence. So historians had to look elsewhere, to civilizations that finally had something durable to study. The first real clue comes from ancient Egypt, thousands of years later. Egyptians had access to papyrus, a tall, reed-like plant growing along the Nile. They softened strips of it by hand, rolling them into compact, absorbent tubes. It functioned almost exactly like an early tampon, inserted rather than worn externally. It was clever, it was practical, and it required skill most households simply had. Move west, across the Mediterranean, into ancient Greece. The physician Hippocrates left behind something historians rarely get, an actual written description. He recorded women wrapping soft lint around small pieces of wood. Wood gave it shape and structure. Lint gave it the absorbency the moment required. It was a design specific enough to suggest it had been refined over generations already. Now travel to Rome, where the story splits sharply along class lines. Wealthy Roman women had access to wool, second only to cotton in raw absorbency. Wool could be cut, shaped, and reused specifically for this single purpose. Poorer women had no such luxury. They tore rags from worn-out clothing instead. Old tunics, old bed sheets. Whatever fabric had already outlived its original purpose. The material mattered less than the outcome. Something absorbent, something replaceable, something quiet. Meanwhile, far from Rome, other continents were solving the exact same problem independently. In equatorial Africa, women wove tightly rolled mats from local grasses. The grass was abundant, flexible, and easy to shape by hand within minutes. Across the ocean, indigenous women in North America turned to a very different material. Soft buffalo hide, tanned and shaped, paired again with moss for absorbency, different continents, different plants, different animals, the exact same underlying need. No contact between these groups, and yet remarkably similar solutions kept appearing. That pattern alone tells you something important about how universal the problem really was. It was not a niche inconvenience. It touched every culture that has ever existed. And still, almost none of these solutions made it into official written history. Ask yourself why that might be, and the answer is uncomfortable but simple. Menstruation was treated across nearly every ancient culture as something impure, something to be hidden, managed quietly, spoken about only in whispers, if at all. Religious texts, philosophical writings, medical treatises, most simply ignored the subject entirely. When it was mentioned, it was often framed as danger, contamination, or weakness. Historians did not fail to find evidence because none existed. They failed because the evidence was never considered important enough to preserve on purpose. This is where the story would normally end, buried under thousands of years of silence. But in the 1930s, in the hills of eastern Kentucky, something changed that. Archaeologists began excavating a site called Newt Cache Shelter, tucked into a rocky overhang. What they found there did not look like an ordinary campsite at all. Caches of nuts and seeds, carefully stored rather than scattered. Spoons carved delicately from shells, shaped for careful, deliberate use. Soft plant fibers, clearly gathered and prepared, not simply left behind by accident. Bedding materials, arranged with a level of care unusual for a temporary stop. And medicinal plants, the kind used specifically to ease pain and manage bleeding. Radiocarbon dating placed the site at roughly 4,000 years old. Archaeologists studying the assemblage proposed something remarkable, though not fully proven. This may not have been an ordinary shelter at all. It may have been a retreat, set apart specifically for menstruating or postpartum women. A dedicated space, stocked deliberately, maintained across repeated visits over time. If that interpretation holds, it changes the entire shape of the story. This was not neglect. This was infrastructure, built quietly, without ceremony, without written record. Someone gathered those seeds. Someone carved those shell spoons by hand. Someone chose those specific healing plants and carried them there on purpose. That is not the behavior of a culture that considered the subject irrelevant. That is the behavior of a culture that built something and simply never wrote about it. The silence in the history books, then, was never about the truth. It was about which truths got recorded and which ones were quietly left out. Every era added its own layer to that same pattern. Moss and leather in the deepest prehistory, vanishing without a trace on purpose. Papyrus in Egypt, wool in Rome, rags passed quietly between poorer households, grass mats woven by hand across Africa. Buffalo hide prepared with care in North America, a shelter in Kentucky, stocked with tools nobody thought to name. Different materials, different centuries, different continents entirely. The same repeating shape underneath all of it. Solve the problem, then say nothing about it. Think about how strange that really is, once you sit with it for a moment. No other universal human experience was treated quite this way. Eating was documented in obsessive detail, recipe after recipe, across every civilization. Death was recorded in monuments, tombs, epic poems written to be remembered forever. But menstruation, something experienced by roughly half the population every month for decades, got almost nothing. Not because it lacked importance, because importance was never the deciding factor. Shame was the deciding factor, and shame does not build monuments. It builds silence, instead, generation after generation, without anyone ever choosing it directly. Somewhere in that silence, real ingenuity was happening the entire time. Someone had to test which mosses held liquid the longest. Someone had to learn which leaves caused irritation and which ones stayed gentle against skin. Someone had to figure out how tightly to roll papyrus so it would not fall apart. Someone had to decide exactly how much wool a single cloth needed to absorb enough. None of these people left their names behind. None of them needed to. The knowledge simply passed from person to person, quietly, the way survival knowledge always has. Mother to daughter, elder to younger woman. Whispered, demonstrated, never formally taught in any school. And it worked. It worked well enough that the species never stopped moving forward because of it. No war was lost over this problem. No civilization collapsed because of it. It was handled, invisibly, every single month, by every single generation, without fail. That is not a footnote to history. That is one of its quietest engines. Now, think about the shelter in Kentucky one more time. 4,000 years ago, someone thought this problem deserved a dedicated space. Not a corner of a cave. An entire structure, stocked, returned to, maintained. That decision required planning. It required resources. It required a form of respect, a respect that never once made it into anyone's official record. Consider what else may be sitting undiscovered, in soil nobody has excavated yet. Other shelters, other caches, other quiet solutions to the exact same ancient problem. Archaeology can only speak where evidence survives, and organic materials rarely survive that long. So the story we have today is almost certainly incomplete, patched together from scattered fragments. Even so, the pattern that does survive tells a consistent story. Every culture solved this. Every culture innovated, quietly, without asking for credit. And every culture, in its own way, decided this story did not belong in its books. That decision was never about the women who lived it. It was about a discomfort that outlived the very cultures that felt it. Now fast forward past centuries of silence into the one era that finally, reluctantly, started writing this story down on paper, in patent offices instead of temples. The shift did not begin with a product designed on purpose. It began, almost by accident, on a battlefield. During the First World War, a company producing surgical dressings had developed a material called cellulose wadding. Cheap, absorbent, mass-produced by machine rather than by hand for the first time in this story's entire history. Battlefield nurses, working with wounded soldiers, noticed something the manufacturer had not intended at all. That surgical material worked remarkably well for managing menstruation too. Word spread quietly among the nurses themselves, the same way knowledge always had in this story, person to person, without official instruction. After the war ended, the company took that accidental discovery and turned it into a named, marketed product for the first time in recorded history. It went on sale in the 1920s, sold under a brand name still recognizable today. But even then, shame had not gone anywhere. It had simply changed shape. Stores displayed the boxes discreetly, sometimes letting customers leave payment in an honesty box so they never had to hand it directly to a clerk. Advertisements spoke in euphemism, never naming the function outright, still treating the subject as something to be managed quietly rather than said plainly. A decade later, in the 1930s, an American physician named Earl Haas patented a compact applicator-based design worn internally, closer in spirit to that ancient Egyptian papyrus tube than to anything else in between. He struggled to find backers willing to manufacture it. Investors, uneasy discussing the subject at all, repeatedly turned him down. Eventually, a businesswoman named Gertrude Tendrich bought the patent directly and began producing it herself, by hand, in her own apartment before demand outgrew the space entirely. The product she built from that patent is still one of the most recognizable names in the category today, thousands of years after the first papyrus tube was rolled by hand along the Nile. Even as the technology modernized, the pattern this entire story keeps circling back to did not disappear. Advertising avoided direct language for decades longer. Television networks refused to air commercials for these products at all, until well into the 20th century. Some countries still tax menstrual products differently from other basic necessities today, a policy debated in parliaments as recently as the last few years. The silence never fully vanished. It only moved, from stone shelters and unrecorded recipes into boardrooms, advertising standards, and tax codes. So, the next time a history book skips over this subject entirely, notice the gap. That gap is not empty. It is simply unwritten. Underneath it sits thousands of years of invention, adaptation, and quiet, unclaimed expertise. A story that happened to every woman, in every era, in every corner of the world, told finally, not because it suddenly became important, told because someone finally decided it was worth writing down.